My father taught maps for a living. He wore his knowledge like a well-folded scarf, not flashy, always there. The summer after his funeral, I took his aluminum skiff out onto Quarry Lake with his old lead line. Thick cord marked every fathom with rags, ending in a lump of lead molded with an indentation for tallow. "For the feel of the bottom," he'd say, pressing a thumbprint into the soft grease. Mud sticks, sand scratches, rock speaks. The lake was a mined-out wound that filled with time and runoff. Locals swore there was no bottom in the middle. Locals always say that about holes that have taken more than men. I rowed to the place where the wind died, a circular patch where water looked thicker. I dropped the line. The lead sank with that impatient, righteous speed heavy things have. Rag after rag slipped past my hand until the last mark left my fingers, and the line kept sliding, humming lightly against the gunwale. I pinched it, and it burned the skin with a small, shocked kiss. The boat slewed, and the line snapped tight as if something below had reached the end of its patience. For a long second, it felt as if the skiff might be the bait end of a rule I hadn't learned. Then slack. The line drifted at an angle like a sentence choosing not to finish. I hauled hand over hand. Tallow returned smeared with something gray that tasted like pennies when the wind put a fleck on my lip. Not mud, not rock. A softness that wanted a shape. A voice came from the water beside the hull, very conversational. "You're measuring the wrong thing." It sounded like my father. Not the way recordings sound like the dead, flat and tidy, but with the warmth of someone arranging chairs in your mind. He had used that tone to teach me fractions and grief and how to apologize properly to a river after throwing a rock. "I'm measuring depth," I said, because talking back seemed less foolish than refusing. "Depth is a number," the water said in my father's voice. "You need the measure of invitation." A hand rose, palm up, as if expecting me to set the lead there. It wasn't a horror hand, no bones showing, no dramatic color. A human hand seen through a foot of water looks darker, that's all. The wrist vanished into water with the resigned neatness of a sleeve. I did not give it the lead because the lead belonged to my father, and although I am practical, I am also sentimental in inconvenient ways. The hand withdrew politely. The boat made the small, friendly knock sound it does when it is pleased with a breeze. The voice, still my father's, said, "It doesn't matter. You've already marked yourself." The line twitched. A wet rag rose from nothing and tied itself around the cord between my hands, neat sailor's knot. The rag was not cloth. It was a pale length of something that wanted to be cloth the way a rumor wants to be news. It tightened the knot with the habitual competence of a person who works without thinking. I cut it off with a pocket knife, and the knife's edge lost a hair of sharpness, as if the rag had eaten it like a small meal. "I don't want this," I said softly, and the voice in the water sighed, a sound my father made when I announced decisions he could not forbid. "Then row," it said, and a second hand rose on the opposite side of the boat. Same palm, same expectation, so that to watch both, I would have had to split my attention, which is how people fall in and call it fate. I rowed badly at first. Fear is not an emergency, it's a math error. Oars slopped. The skiff cranked 90 degrees and then another. The hands kept pace easily, unbothered by my inefficiency. In the middle distance, the far shore remained uncommitted. The sun grew blunt. The voice continued, steady as a lecture. Not threats, not bargains, instructions. Throw the lead, make a new mark, let the line teach you what you are. The hands waited with polite confidence, as if this lesson had been given 1,000 times and most students come around. When the pine tops on shore finally began to drift right instead of stubbornly away, I found a rhythm. Rowing is a deal. You look where you've been, your body promises where you'll go. The hands slid backward, accepting the distance without resentment. The voice quieted and blended to water noises, glub, chuckle, tap. By the time the skiff kissed reeds, the lake sounded like the boring, beloved thing it had been in childhood. The kind of sound you can't quote to prove it was ever otherwise. I dragged the boat up on gravel with ceremonial awkwardness and sat in it on dry land because the shape of it made me brave. The lead line lay coiled like a skin I'd shed. I didn't touch it. That night I dreamed my father was measuring a window with a cloth tape, and the tape slid through his fingers into the dark past the glass, and he laughed once, delighted, before remembering what laughter does to the dead. I stayed a week. I did not take the boat out again. You cannot argue with a lake when it's in the mood to be generous, and generosity is often a door you can't close properly once it learns your name. I walked the shore and skipped stones and counted how many skips matched how many times the voice had said it doesn't matter. It's a petty habit. It kept my mind busy. On the last day, I carried the lead line to the dock with a plan. Return it to depth with a clean cut and no ceremony. Let the lake keep the thing it had already tasted. Halfway down the planks, a little girl fishing with a red bobber looked up and said, without hello, "That line is wrong." "How so?" I asked, mastering my voice. "It's marked in mouths," she said, as if repeating something an adult had told her. Then she grinned and whistled to her father, who did not look up from untangling a knot in his spinning reel. I sat with the lead in my lap until the timbers under me warmed with sun. Then I cut the cord 3 feet from the lead, tied a neat eye, and hung the weight on a nail in the boathouse where my father once hung oars to winter. The remaining cord I flung into the reeds. Something under the surface accepted it with a softness like a wet towel returning to water. I drove away with the skiff in my rearview mirror like a pet I'd left to fend for itself. At a gas station an hour down the road, I noticed a crease of gray across my palm. Not dirt, not bruise. A tide line where the rag had wrapped the cord and brushed my hand as it tied its quick, polite knot. It doesn't wash off. It doesn't hurt. Sometimes in crowded rooms, I look down and see it and know, with the calm that follows panic's last wave, that depth is still a number, and I still don't have it. What I have is a measure of invitation, thin as a scar, neat as a seam, and the understanding that some lessons keep teaching even when you have left the classroom. We rented the last cabin on the North Shore because nobody else wanted it. The path to it ribboned between black spruce and a stand of tamarack that whispered all night whether there was wind or not. The lake out front was wide, the color of coins. An old dock extended into it like a finger pointed at a mistake. By the second day, we pretended to call the cabin ours. It was Mark who fed the heron. He said he wasn't feeding it, just tossing leftover minnows into the reeds because letting them die in a bucket felt wrong. The bird learned fast. It stood on the dock each evening with that monk-still patience heron's own, motionless until a minnow hit water, then a blur of neck, the neat surgical grab. The first time it did it, we cheered under our breath like a respectful audience. By the third, Mark was talking to it as if it rented the other half of the duplex. By the fifth, it had a schedule. "You're teaching it to beg," I said, not unkindly. "I'm teaching it that the world can be easier than the catalog says," he answered. "And there's not much you can say to the part of a friend that believes in mercy like a rule." On the 7th night, the heron didn't come. We stood on the dock with a bucket of minnows that watched us through round gold lash eyes and did not blink. The world around us went quiet with a precision that suggested appointment. "Maybe it's late," Mark said, and a different bird landed on the far end of the dock. Not a heron. Smaller, brown-gray, legs too thin to be useful, beak wrong. It watched us and then watched the minnows with an attention that felt like a person trying on someone else's coat. "It wants us to show it how," Mark said, and tossed one minnow into the water. The small bird cocked its head, then stepped its delicate nothing legs forward, and waited as if the act of waiting were the meal. We stood there several minutes. The minnow swam small, panicked circles under the dock. The bird lifted one foot and set it down, testing the dock's grammar. The real heron landed in the reeds with a soft, embarrassed sound. It stalked forward, regal as always, made its clean strike, and swallowed with the efficiency of plumbing. The small bird shivered, adjusted a feather that didn't need adjusting, and watched us again. Mark reached for another minnow. I put my hand on his wrist. "Don't," I said. "It'll learn the wrong lesson." "Which is?" "That we know what we're doing." He laughed and threw anyway. The small bird repeated its imitation of waiting. The real heron ignored us now, fishing properly, a professional clocked in. When we finally went inside, the small bird was still standing there, as if the dock were a rule it had sworn to keep. That night I woke to the sound of footsteps on the dock. Not animals. Wood knows the difference. These were careful human steps, avoiding squeaks they had practiced finding. I slid out from the sheet and moved to the window with that gentle choreography learned from years of not wanting to alarm anyone. The moon made a thin film on the lake. Out on the dock stood Mark, holding the minnow bucket, and behind him the small bird, taller now by inches, legs longer, beak sharpening as if opinions had hardened. He crouched and tossed. It waited. The minnows splashed and turned silver throats to sky and were not taken. He spoke to it in that voice you keep for stubborn dogs and frightened children. Patient, assured, flattering. The bird trembled, then straightened, then trembled again. I spotted the real heron watching from the reeds, neck tucked, body a held sentence. When Mark came back to bed, he smelled like the dock's damp breath. "It won't take when anyone is around," he whispered, pleased, as if the bird had given him privacy rather than refusing to feed. In the morning, footprints ringed the sand by the dock, three-toed impressions too far apart for the small bird who had first landed, too shallow for anything heavy. They led from the water into the path and back, as if something had checked the cabin door without trying the knob. The heron made one precise exclamation and then resumed normal work. We left the next day's minnows in a plastic bag in the fridge. When I opened the door at noon, the bag sat against the milk with a thumbprint pressed into the condensation, as if a finger had hovered there, interested, not sure of rights. That evening, the small bird came alone. It was almost right now, heron-shaped the way a good forgery is painting-shaped. It moved wrong, though. Herons do not shuffle, they materialize. This one fidgeted. It tried 3 poses in a row, then settled on the first, as if learning to be elegant from a manual. I tossed in a minnow. It waited. I tossed in 2, 3. It waited. Mark touched my elbow and said, "Lo, pleased. It only eats in the dark." We stayed late. The mosquitoes made their demands, and we paid them with small slaps and irritations we pretended not to mind. The small bird grew taller as the light drained. Its shadow slid along the dock and learned the railing. When the last color left the sky like a person who couldn't stay any longer, the bird struck. Not quick, not surgical. It plunged its whole head under with a slurp, then lifted, trembling, snapped its beak twice, and swallowed like a child hiding tears. It looked at us then, really looked. That forward set stare predators reserve for other predators. I felt distinctly that I had been mistaken for a teacher and had performed the role long enough to be hired. The real heron made no sound. It stepped backward into the reeds and disappeared, not offended, relieved. We locked the cabin door that night with a key that had never mattered until then. In sleep, I dreamed of staging a play at a school for birds. The principal had Mark's face and kept asking for motivation. Near dawn, a knock made of water sounded on the dock. It was an elegant sound, 3 notes equally spaced, like a polite question delivered by a throat that had rehearsed. We stayed in bed because we knew the answer, and it didn't make a difference. The knock came again, more certain. The doorknob turned once, twice, as if a beak were testing the concept. The lock held, the door seemed surprised, then patient. By noon, the minnow bucket sat emptied on the dock, dry. The footprints went from water to cabin to water again, growing more regular each time, like a signature practicing itself. The real heron did not come back. On our last night, the small bird stood tall at the end of the dock as the sun slid behind the ridge. It had arrived fully into its shape. If you squinted, it was a heron. If you didn't, it was a person pretending to be a bird, the way apprentices pretend to be masters, by doing everything right and nothing true. Mark said, "It'll be fine after we go." "It'll be something," I said. We left the key on the table and locked the knob behind us because habits are what survive when meaning collapses. On the path, the tamarack whispered its 1,000 soft consonants. When we reached the car, a shadow crossed the lake with the satisfaction of a problem solved. 3 months later, the owner emailed to say the last dock had gone missing in a storm. No evidence, just gone, like a finger unsaid. He attached a photo of the shoreline, water lapping at a scar of earth. In the middle distance, a bird stood in the shallows, taller than a heron, and still as a rule. Its head cocked just so, listening for a sound docks make when they remember what they were meant to support. I don't go back to that part of the lake. Some nights, though, when city rain drums the balcony and the sink argues with air in the pipes, I hear the knock. 3 notes, polite, not demanding at all. Just a reminder that if you teach a thing to beg, it might learn to ask properly, and then it will come to your door believing it belongs. By late August, the camp closed to guests, and we stayed on to winterize the docks. Me, the owner's son, and an old fisherman named Harlan, who treated silence like a coat he didn't take off. The lake was a perfect oval, the color of a bruise. Out beyond the last swim platform, a faded rope of buoys marked the drop-off where the bottom fell out like a swallowed stare. "You don't cross that line," Harlan said, not looking up from splicing rope. "Not after Labor Day. It starts keeping count." "What does?" I asked, expecting a story about currents or drunks. He only twisted the rope until it obeyed. We worked the week with the peculiar focus that comes when everything is shutting down. Cabin windows were boarded, canoes stacked belly up like sleeping beetles. At night, loons called with that bright alien laughter that makes humans grin to hide how it feels. The air had that sharpened edge where summer stops pretending. On Thursday, the boy, Evan, dared me to swim the line. It was thick dusk, the sort that makes shore look farther than it is. We stripped to shorts and ran down the dock like kids. Our breath came out as small ghosts. The lake welcomed us the way cold welcomes, with rules. Halfway to the platform, the rope of buoys floated to our left like a taut horizon. Evan veered, I followed, because leadership is sometimes nothing more than refusing to be the first to say no. We swam in quiet kicks, shoulders rolling, our wakes combing the surface. The world shrank to lake and sky, and the two of us making small holes through both. A sound reached us, soft like knuckles drumming on wood. I thought it was the dock settling, then a second, then a third, evenly spaced. Evan stopped. His face, half submerged, became a moon with a dark band through it. "It's counting," he said, but the words came out thick with water. We reached the line. The buoys knocked together with the precise impatience of someone tapping a clock. 1, 2, 3, 4. Evan grabbed the rope and laughed a little, a weak protest at rules. The lake answered with a fifth knock that didn't come from the buoys at all. It came from below, like a knuckle on the underside of a table. The platform lay another 30 yards out. We could have turned back. We didn't. I tell myself it was momentum, but it felt more like being tallied by something that prefers round numbers. At the platform ladder, we clung to aluminum gone cold. The counting stopped. The lake held its breath. Shore was a black belt cinching the world. Harlan stood there, small figure on the dock, hands in the pockets of a jacket I'd never seen before. He didn't wave. He just set his feet like a man prepared to pull. Evan said, "We did it," and the platform knocked from below. One single thud that translated through my fingers into my bones. Not a fish, not a log. It had the certainty of a knuckle that knows the board is exactly this thick. We slid back in without speaking. The water closed us like a parent who has more children than arms. We swam the smoothest strokes our bodies remembered. The counting resumed at our backs. 6, 7, 8, patient as rain. I didn't look. I kept my eyes on Harlan, who had taken a coil of rope and looped it around a piling, as if preparing to anchor a thing that wasn't a boat. At 9, the lake grew heavy. Not the water, the idea of it. The way a story grows when you realize you've been inside it from the start. My legs didn't numb. They slowed, as if the cold had started collecting a tax. 10 echoed under my palm on the surface. Harlan shouted a single word I couldn't catch and flung the rope in a long, practiced throw. It draped over Evan's shoulders and then mine, and he hauled with a steadiness that stole no effort for show. We slid toward the dock as if the lake had agreed to a bargain and was honoring it out of pride. 11 thudded. 12 came with a small tug at my ankle like a child learning to hold hands. At the ladder, Harlan hauled me up and over as if I weighed a season. He didn't touch Evan until both my knees were on wood. Then he leaned like a man in a storm and yanked the boy up so hard we all fell in a wet pile. The lake stopped counting. The rope of buoys lay still, blue beads on a string at a funeral. Harlan cut the lake a look I've only seen at hospital beds, then looked at us and said, conversational, "You pay attention when a place starts keeping numbers. First time, it's curious. Second time, it exacts." We winterized faster after that. On Saturday, I paddled out to bring in the swim platform. When I reached the line, I saw indentations along the lake side of the buoys. little crescents pressed in rubber, evenly spaced, as if teeth had tested each one for ripeness. I unlatched the platform chain with a set of movements I let my hands remember without my brain. As I towed it in, something under the surface moved beside me with the disinterested efficiency of a train. I didn't look. We left the platform on shore, upside down. When the first snow fell, it filled with white until it became a solid block, like a tooth we'd knocked out of a mouth and saved as proof. In spring, when guests returned and the loon laughter made them clink beer bottles in shy wonder, we set a new buoy line 5 yards closer to shore. Nobody asked. The lake allowed it. Sometimes, when dusk flattens the world and the kids go quiet because a hush told them to, I hear faint texting on wood from far beyond the new line, polite, rhythmic, not impatient at all. It's still counting. We just decided not to be part of its arithmetic.